It's going. Hello, everybody. I am here at an undisclosed location somewhere in Canada with my good friend Patrick Moore. And Patrick Moore is, in my view, one of the most compelling environmentalists in the world. He is a sensible environmentalist. He is the one of the founding members of Greenpeace, but left that organization many decades ago due to their extremism. That's how I would put it. Maybe you would put it slightly differently. But I'm here with him today to talk about many things. Bill C-12 for one, but also his new book. So if you don't mind, Patrick, could you just give us just a brief background of who you are? I think you're a very famous person and known all over the world, but if you could just give us a bit of a background, that'd be great.
Well, Derek, I was lucky to be born up on the north end of Vancouver Island in the wilderness on a float camp, which as a child in the 1950s and 60s was a pretty unusual place to be. But I was imbued with nature. It was all around me, the tide flats, the forest, the ocean, and just out beyond our inlet was the whole Pacific. So I began to start fishing when I was about 6 years old, and I had a boat when I was 8 and an outboard by the time I was 10. So I was pretty free to discover nature, and that's what gave me the innate love of the wilderness and the world that I have to this day. I ended up, though, having to go to boarding school in Vancouver because the one-room school I was going to only went to grade 8. And I got to go to a very good private school, St. George's, as a full boarder, and excelled in science, top of my class, and ended up going to UBC, University of British Columbia, doing a life science Bachelor of Science honors in forestry and biology, a combined honors in those two subjects. And then I had a chance to go to any university I wanted in the world, practically. I had a Ford Foundation fellowship coming out of my BSc, but I went to St. Louis because I wanted to go to Washington University there and study under David Gates, who was the head guy in the world on photosynthesis, which to me at that time was kind of the holy grail. How plants can just take water and carbon dioxide and make sugars that provide the energy for the whole of life. I mean, that was why I saw it as the holy grail. And I went to St. Louis, and it was the year after the Martin Luther King assassination and the riots that burnt down the whole middle of the city. And I'm going, gee, I really don't think it was like the Hobbit coming out of the Shire going to see Mordor, and I just didn't want to do that. I realized I did not want to go to the United States at that time in history, so I came home to Vancouver and asked my profs if I could do my PhD in ecology at the same university I'd done my bachelor's in, and they said sure. And I was really lucky because I got the likes of David Suzuki teaching me genetics. At that time he was non-political and really was a wonderful teacher of the new understanding of DNA and all of the cellular mechanisms involved. And so I had incredible teachers. I studied environmental law, I studied environmental economics, I studied oceanography, I studied all of the aspects of a large copper mine that was going in on the north end of Vancouver Island where I was from, and ended up doing this PhD, interdisciplinary PhD in ecology. But while I was doing it, you know, this was the height of the Cold War and the height of the Vietnam War and the threat of all-out nuclear war. I mean, it was a scary time to be a young person. And it was also the time of the emerging consciousness of the environment. The word ecology had not yet been written in the public media at the time I was doing my PhD. Eventually it would be, of course, and end up occupying a very big chunk of human thought. But at that point, it was just the word environment was coming in to vogue, and I got on that bandwagon, joined a group in a church basement in Vancouver called the Don't Make a Wave Committee, and ended up being on the first voyage of Greenpeace 6 months later, after helping plan it all through its early stages, on a little fishing boat against the U.S. hydrogen bomb tests run by arguably the most powerful organization in the world, the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and we won. In the end, President Nixon canceled the planned remaining hydrogen bomb tests in that series, and that was the beginning of Greenpeace, in which I stayed for 15 years in the top committee, leading many campaigns, including some of the campaigns for the Save the Whales 4 years in the Pacific against the Soviet and Japanese whaling fleets. Now you call them the Russian and Japanese whaling fleets, and we won that one too, and on, toxic wastes and baby seals. But in the end, my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education as I did, began to adopt positions I couldn't accept. The first and sort of philosophical one was they started to say that humans are the enemies of nature. Humans are the enemies of the earth. And this was sort of like they're saying humans are the only bad species in the whole world. All 1.7 million other species besides people are fine, except we are bad. It's too much like original sin for me, and I'm not really into that kind of fundamentalist religion. And so I had to leave, but it took me a while after that general principle became prevalent of saying humans were the enemies. It was a sharp point of the stick that got me to finally have to leave, and that was when my fellow directors adopted a policy to campaign against chlorine worldwide, to ban chlorine worldwide. Now, chlorine is one of the 94 natural elements. It's the 11th most common element in the Earth's crust. I don't think an environmental group can ban an element. But more seriously, chlorine was the most important element of all 94 for public health by adding it to drinking water, swimming pools, and spas to prevent waterborne communicable diseases like cholera. But chlorine is also used to produce 85% of all our medicines, and is actually present in 25%, actually contains chlorine in 25% of our medicines. So obviously it would be stupid to say ban chlorine worldwide, but you know, that kind of fell in with their enemies of the earth idea. So who cares about the people? And it came to that, and that is when I had to leave, because I know humans are one of the species that evolved on this earth along with the rest of life, and is part of nature just like all the other species. We're a very interesting and unique species in many ways, but so are many other species. The differentiation among species is so profound. There's 1.7 million of them, and many of them are very different from each other in their own ways. They aren't humans, though, and we are a very interesting and unique and new species on this planet, but to condemn us as evil or the enemies of nature is simply wrong.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, and in a similar way, and I'm just going to grab your book if I don't mind. I've had my own sort of issues with a group that I believe at one time was a positive force, but I've diverged from it ideologically, and that is the Conservative Party, who's apparently seems to stand for two things that I adamantly disagree with. One is this policy of blanket lockdowns, where we're shutting down society indiscriminately without any real sense, and the other is the adoption of climate alarmism, which is something that you are very articulate in speaking against. And one of the issues, of course, that I have, and many people don't realize this, is that the Liberal government has put forward a bill, Bill C-12, which is like the Paris Agreement on steroids. In fact, it basically implements the goal, the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement. So the part that people agreed to was specific reductions in greenhouse gases, and that was something that I've always been against. But sort of the long-term goal was net zero by 2050. And so the Liberals have moved from sort of the easy part of well, I shouldn't say easy, but the main part of the Paris Agreement, which is these 30% reductions, to an aim for net zero by 2050. And that is something that the Conservatives have also agreed to support. I believe I'm the only sitting member of Parliament that is against that. And I just wanted to get your take as an environmentalist on the feasibility of net zero, and secondly, the advisability of net zero. And before we get into that, I'm going to just mention your book. And I'm going to brag for Patrick in his stead. This is his latest book.
Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom.
That's right.
We will perish in flames.
That's right. And I'll just read you the back of this here. And Patrick says, "It dawned on me one day that most of the scare stories in the media today are based on things that are invisible, like CO2, or very remote, like polar bears and coral reefs. Thus, the average person cannot observe and verify the truth of these claims for themselves. They must rely on the activists, the media, the politicians, and the scientists, all of whom have huge financial and/or political interests in the subject, to tell them the truth. And I will say there's another great book that you've written 10 or 12 years ago. I have a copy at my home right now. It's a great book. This one here, you told me, is number 2 on Amazon.com for environmental books right now. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, and it's number 1 in Canada for environmental books. And there, there's not 8,000 environmental books, but there's quite a few of them. And
Yes.
somehow in 4 weeks, my book has risen to number 1. And the main reason for that is, first, it covers a lot of different issues. It's not just about climate change. It's about coral reefs and polar bears and GMOs and nuclear energy and trees and forests and even more. I mean, there's 11 chapters all on a different subject, showing you that the common denominator is that these are scare stories that you cannot verify and observe yourself, because they are either invisible, like CO2, radiation, and whatever's in GMOs, which doesn't even have a name, and yet they tell you there's something dangerous in it, doesn't have a chemical formula. So this is what my book is about, all those subjects, but also it's written for non-scientists. Grade 9 and up is fine. If you have a proficiency in English, you'll have no trouble reading my book and comprehending it. So it is meant for families, for parents to buy, read it, give it to your high school children and your older children, and spread it throughout your family. Because it's the first book of its kind that is not just about climate change, it's about the whole range of issues that are based on things that you can't verify for yourself, and therefore must depend on the people who are making billions of dollars from these scare stories, and they don't want you to know that they're fake, and you can't prove that they're fake because you can't go to the Arctic Circle and count all the polar bears for yourself. It's simple as that. But it's a very detailed book, even though it's in plain English that anyone can understand, and please buy it. It's only $3.99 some of the time when it's on sale. It's $7.99 as a Kindle. It costs more as an actual book, but that's because it has 100 color plates in order to make it more understandable to people.
And yeah, I appreciate that, and I highly recommend the book. And of course, I'm not invested in the book or anything like that, but it's certainly invested in the common sense approach that's behind it. Now, Patrick, if you could just comment a little bit, how bad will supporting C12 be for Canada, and why should every single member of Parliament, and particularly Conservative members of Parliament, be adamantly against this bill? Why is it a mistake to support this bill? Well, this is the net zero bill.
First, because it's probably the most nonsensical policy that is being adopted around the Western countries of this world. It's not being adopted in China, it's not being adopted in India, it's not being adopted in Russia or the other Asian countries or South American countries. They all pay lip service to it, but China, for example, says it's going to do something by 2060. So they might as well put it out 1,000 years if they say it's going to be 2060. But on the other hand, saying you're going to get to net zero fossil fuel consumption by 2050 is only 29 years away. That is an impossible task. In other words, this is an impossible policy. It's just a bunch of virtue signaling. But in the final analysis, though, they want CO2 to be considered poison. They want it to be considered something that if we keep putting into the atmosphere, it is going to destroy the Earth. People are actually talking about the end of the Earth coming before 2050, like in 10 or 12 years. I ask people who buy into this end of the Earth thing, you can't just say end of the Earth. What does the end of the Earth look like? Is it going to implode? Is it going to explode? Are the seas going to catch on fire? Is everything going to die all at once in 10 years from now? It's such a stupid thing to say, the end of the world. And I honestly believe that many people, especially since religion has been lost to a large percentage of the population, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm not afraid of death. And I believe that people are projecting their own fear of death when their own world ends. They see the end of their own life as the end of the world, and they're projecting that out to being the actual world.
Well, that's very perceptive, and I believe what you're saying is that as traditional religions have faded, people have adopted new ideologies that effectively become religious in nature.
Yes, and all
is that what you were saying?
Yes, and all the fundamentalist religions have an end time in them.
Yes, and there's a new fundamentalism and radicalism that is associated with many of these environmental and climate alarmist ideas.
Well, to begin with, climate, just use the word climate, because they call people like me climate deniers. Of course, I don't deny that there is a climate. Obviously there is, we're in it. Then they say climate change deniers, as if you're denying climate change. The climate has been changing since the beginning of the world. It changes all the time, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always surely does it change. The weather always changes too, as everybody knows. So you can't be a climate change denier. No one in the world would fit that category. I mean, unless they actually think the climate never changes, in which case they're nuts.
Well, come to Alberta in the winter, and,
it's always the same cold. But it's not always the same amount of cold, and it's not always at the same time of the month.
That's
and
right.
sometimes it lasts longer than others, and all of those things. It's variable.
Yeah.
But catastrophic climate change is an entirely other matter. That is the doomsday scenario, the end time scenario, which says that something really catastrophic like the Great Flood, or you name it, whatever in mythology is going to happen, and it's time to start throwing virgins into the fire or whatever. And this has gone on all through history, where people blame themselves, or actually it's usually in the old days it was the priests blaming the young women and burning witches. This is a fact of history.
Right.
But
so pay your carbon tax, and that will
absolve
appease
you, yes.
the climate gods.
That will absolve you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's going on here. Carbon dioxide is the basis of all life on Earth. When you take carbon dioxide and water, and a plant, through photosynthesis, makes sugar, glucose, out of carbon dioxide and water. That's the only two things that are necessary to make sugar, except for the whole machinery of the plant, of course, which is a miracle in itself. But that is how sugar is made. And that sugar is the basis of the energy for all life on Earth, including all the animals like us, because it's only the plants that can photosynthesize, the green plants. Fungi can't photosynthesize, even though they're a plant, because they don't have chlorophyll. But because they're parasites basically on wood very often, on things that are rotten. They're decomposers, but they're not photosynthesizers. So it's the photosynthesizers that are giving us all this energy for all of our life and all the food. So between the two of them, between the plants give us the two things, all our food and all our energy in the final analysis. And so demonizing carbon dioxide should be done very, very carefully, seeing as the most important food for all life. So there we go, starting with that. The fact is, and the great irony of the situation is, and anybody can see this by either reading my book or looking it up on the internet.
And I'm gonna say the title again. When I was holding it up, apparently it shows up backwards for people. So it is Fake, Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Oh, sorry, it's still backwards, but I read it out, and
I can't even pronounce it backwards.
Yes, the author is Patrick Moore. You can get it at Amazon.ca, and if you happen to be watching from the States, you can get it from Amazon.com.
I think you can get the Kindle from any Amazon, as a matter of fact, because it comes electronically. But carbon dioxide is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been, even today, even with our addition of more CO2 into the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, CO2 has been in a net decline for the last 500 million years, going back about as far as we can sort of know what the CO2 content was of the atmosphere through studying ocean sediment cores, which go back that far. And we can tell from different isotopes in the sediments approximately what the CO2 level was in the atmosphere. And it was so much higher then. In the beginning of modern life, which is called the Cambrian explosion of life, CO2 was at least 5 and probably 10 times higher than it is today. And life flourished. That was the great flourishing of life that occurred during the Cambrian explosion of multicellular life forms on this earth, which eventually came out of the sea onto the land about 400 million years ago, or plus a bit. So CO2 is the basis of all of that. And yet it has been sinking gradually in the atmosphere due to life taking it out and putting it in fossil fuels and carbonaceous rocks. People don't know much about carbonaceous rocks, but limestone is a carbonaceous rock. And almost all of it is of life origin, from the shells of creatures in the sea that learn to take calcium and carbon dioxide and combine them into calcium carbonate to make protective shells for themselves. It was an incredibly important evolutionary advance for soft-bodied marine animals to build armor plating for themselves out of calcium carbonate. But unfortunately, and they didn't know this at the time, those shelled creatures, it resulted in gradual depletion of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere to where at the height of the last glaciation, the most recent glaciation, there will probably be more because there were more than 40 before that during this Pleistocene ice age that we're in now. At the height of the most recent glaciation, 20,000 years ago, CO2 sank to 180 parts per million, the lowest it's been in the history of the Earth. That's 4.6 billion years. The lowest it's been in all that time because it's been taken out by life itself and put into sediments. And when the oceans cool, they absorb more gas and more CO2 included, and that's why it went to a low point then. Coming out of the most recent glaciation into this Holocene interglacial period, which took about 10,000 years from 20,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, CO2 rose to 260 ppm, and then gradually through the Holocene rose to 280. And that's when we came along with our fossil fuel consumption and have taken it back up to 415, which is still only 10% of the very lowest it would have been in the past. It was probably much higher than that. And what that means is we are not polluting the environment with CO2. We are restoring a balance to the global CO2 cycle, the carbon cycle on this planet, which goes between the atmosphere, the plants on the land, and the oceans. Because the oceans hold a lot of CO2 just like the atmosphere does. As a matter of fact, they hold nearly 50 times as much as the atmosphere. And the phytoplankton, the plants in the ocean, use the CO2 in the oceans the same way as the plants on the lands do. Through photosynthesis, they produce sugars which provide the energy for the whole food chain in the sea, right up to the biggest things like the whales and all the fish and the seals and sea lions and everything else. All depend on these microscopic plants to do photosynthesis. So CO2 is lower now than it has been virtually in the entire history of the world. The temperature of the Earth is about 14.9 degrees Celsius now on average. This is lower than it has been for the last 150 million years, since the end of the last ice age. Sorry, I should have said 250 million years. I get my 100 million years mixed up sometimes. The Karoo Ice Age lasted for 100 million years, from 350 to 250 million years ago. This is all on the internet. You can look up the temperature of the Earth back 500 million years. And then it dropped off and cooled, then it warmed out of that ice age into a 250 million year period of warmer climate. And for the last 50 million years, the climate has been cooling. You can see the graph of that easily too, out of what's called the Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago. The climate has cooled down and down and down to where first the Antarctic started freezing over. There was no ice at all on the Earth in between these two ice ages. And then gradually the northern hemisphere ice came about 3 million years ago, and we were set into what is known as the Pleistocene ice age, which we are still in today. So CO2 is lower now and temperature is lower now than most of the history of all life. And they're saying CO2 is too high and so is temperature too high, and they are wrong about that. Life would do much better in a warmer climate with more CO2 than we have today, and there is no evidence that the existing amount of CO2 we have put into the atmosphere is the cause of the very slight warming that has been happening since the peak of the Little Ice Age 300 years ago, when the climate started warming again, as it did into the medieval warming period 1,000 years ago, as it did into the Roman warm period, which is warmer than today for sure, 2,000 years ago, and going on and on back into climate for millions of years. So that is the truth of the matter, and anybody can see it, and if you read my book, you will see that it is true.
And I know that we both have to get back to our meeting here, but so I just wanted to say, with respect to this net zero legislation, is this a giant trap that the Conservatives are walking into, and should voters make this a line in the sand with respect to what their elected member of parliament will do in regards to net zero legislation? Is this something that is potentially catastrophic for Canada, and will basically be a huge transfer of wealth to other countries, like you said, like China, that are not playing by the same rules? Do you agree with that assessment of things?
Well, Derek, there's so many variables and facets to this thing, but basically it's a suicide pact to think we can end the use of fossil fuels in 30 years. That's the first point. And it's impossible. It will not happen, so it's just a fake thing to begin with. The carbon tax is the same. All it does is damage the economy and make us use more expensive energy, which is less reliable. And that's why Texas and California and Australia are having blackouts, because they're finally getting to where they're putting so much wind and solar on the grid, which is unreliable, that it's making the grid unreliable as a whole. And there's lots of work done on this. It's very easy to find out. But the fact, say we did stop using fossil fuels completely over a period of the next couple of decades.
Or somehow balance it out with their complex calculations and carbon capture technology and other types of things.
No, that's all smoke and mirrors. There's no way. It takes energy to capture carbon, so you'd have to use the energy to capture the carbon. And so that means you need more energy. It's the same thing with hydrogen, the hydrogen myth, that we're going to run the whole economy on hydrogen. There's no hydrogen mines. You have to produce hydrogen with energy in a factory.
Yes.
So this is not going to happen. So if we did go to net zero, so let's say we just did it right now, it's net zero. There wouldn't be a tree left on this planet in a few years. They would all be used for energy, because that would be the only major reliable energy source left. Where we started, I think 400,000 years ago, they know we were using fire. We were burning wood that long ago. That's the beginning of human civilization, really, is the use of fire and the control of fire. So to warm our caves and to cook our food. And so they're going to end that, of course. And then they're going to end using fossil fuels to do that, so that we have to go back to using wood. And there's a lot of people on this earth, and the trees wouldn't last for very long if they did that. The other thing is there would be mass starvation. If you take fossil fuels out of agriculture, for example, how do the big tractors and combines continue to work out there in the fields without going back to subsistence agriculture, where about 70 to 80% of the whole population is involved in grinding stoop labor in agriculture, as they are still today in Bangladesh and Mali and a few other countries, but they're coming out of it and they're very happy that they are. So if we did that, then how would the big trucks, like you can run a car on a battery, but you can't run a 50-ton tractor trailer on a battery, coming into the city at night with all the food for the people who live on the 30th floor of the condos. The starvation would begin in the center of the 500 urban populations where there's more than 1 million people. That's where it would start, and it would spread out from there, along with violence and possibly even worse things, like what happens when people crash in airplanes on mountains and go in lifeboats at the sea. That kind of thing would happen. And so it would be a terrible catastrophe for the whole population of the world if we just ended fossil fuel use, because it's 80 to 85% of all our energy consumption, and it is absolutely essential for the continuation of the long life, the wealth, and the freedom that we have today.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much, and I appreciate your comments. And I'll just mention your book one more time, and I'll clarify I have no interest in the book, financially or otherwise, but I believe that Patrick Moore has been a very cogent and critical voice in dealing with the extremism we're seeing, the fundamentalism that we're seeing with climate change and environmental things generally. Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom by Dr. Patrick Moore. Thank you so much for being here with me today, and I always enjoy when we get to chat and see each other. And thank you all. I noticed we've had well over 600 people watching us live, and I suspect that over 100,000 will watch this video over the next couple of days. Thank you for being here with me today, and thank you, Dr. Moore. God bless you, and God bless Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks very much for the opportunity.